Hey everyone, welcome back. We are here as a team this week to discuss the new Ricoh GR4. And Mitchell's been lucky enough to actually get hands-on with the camera. Mitchell, early assessment.
Yeah, it is essentially, if you liked the GR3, it has a lot of what made that camera good and refines it a bit more. It's not a radically different camera. I think Ricoh even said, like, listen, we're not breaking or fixing what isn't broken. It still looks the same. In fact, I find it very difficult to tell them apart if I'm looking at pictures of them, at least from straight on. But yeah, it's a refinement, and I think it addresses a lot of pain points that GR3 owners had.
I know this camera has a long history, and there's also quite a backlog of demand for previous models. Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of the GR line?
The GR series is not just a popular digital series. The GR series goes all the way back to 35 millimeter film days. Ricoh gradually evolved it through various permutations in the digital world, and including some very interesting ones in the early days of digital. But the last few variations have been reasonably similar, focus on that small size with an APS-C sensor for really good image quality. And this is really, the whole line is designed to be a photographer's camera. This is a camera designed for enthusiast photographers that really get what they're doing versus someone who's just looking for a quick point and shoot that fits in their pocket.
That is interesting. I do feel like lately, with the popularity of the GR model, there's also an argument to be made about how this is sort of an everyday carry camera, and it actually size-wise is compact enough to fit in a pocket, which pocket we'll get into. But I'm so curious about dedicated photo camera versus your phone, right? That's sort of the impetus I had for purchasing a GRX when I first did.
I think there's two reasons that come to mind. One is that all phones are not equal to cameras. In fact, I would argue that a larger sensor camera is still going to have some advantage over the mobile phone. And that said, mobile phones can do some amazing photography, but very often it's computational photography. It tends to have a certain look to it that you get from stacking images and creating a lot of HDR images. And if you're looking for that kind of classic camera look, by which I mean non-computational look, you're going to get it with a camera like the GR. But I think the other thing that makes the GR series really interesting in the camera world is it is legitimately one of the very few cameras that is almost as pocketable as a mobile phone. We talk a lot about compact cameras, and one of my favorite phrases that gets thrown around in the camera world, and I don't think it's a great one, is pocketable. A lot of times we're talking about this ambiguous jacket pocket something will fit into, and sure, it'll fit into a jacket pocket or something like that. The GR can legitimately fit in the front pocket of your jeans if you want to put it there. And from that perspective,
which is like, it actually hides it. I would be worried about leaning forward and it falling out, but it does fit in there. And compared to my phone, like, it's for sure thicker, but I've walked around with two of these in my pockets. So like one in one pocket, one in the other, and it looked a bit odd, but it didn't feel uncomfortable.
Right. So the use of the phrase everyday carry, this fits that phrase about as well as any camera out on the market. You can slide it in your jeans pocket, or shirt pocket, walk around with it, pull it out when you want it, and just keep it with you. I don't know of really any other camera in this category you can do that with.
Yeah, there's a level of being able to be discreet that obviously also comes with capturing everyday moments, street photography. Mitchell, you have not shot with any GR previous models, is that correct, before working with this one?
I hadn't spent a bunch of time with them. And to be clear, whenever I hold this up, this is the 3, not the 4. We don't have one currently. But talking about what it gives you over cell phone photography is that direct control. There's 2 dials here. There's one here, and I can control them with one hand to choose my aperture, to choose my shutter speed, to choose my focus zone, all that kind of control that you don't typically get on a phone unless you go into a manual mode. And even then, there's only a couple of choices that you have. And if you use an iPhone, they don't give you any of that by default. And it just feels better. Holding this feels better in my hand than trying to use this and tap on a touch screen. The things that some phone makers have done to try to make that experience more tactile, but still hasn't quite gotten to the point of just having those real dials and buttons that you can use.
Dale, you have shot with both the GR3 and the GR3X. Can you tell us a little about your experience with both of those cameras?
Yeah, absolutely. They're both great cameras to shoot with. Obviously, like any product, they have some compromises, and certainly with that size, things can be pretty small. But the thing that I really appreciate about both of those cameras is how discreet you can be with them. And a lot of people like to shoot street photography. I enjoy shooting street photography, but one of the things that is an absolute truism of street photography is very often if you pull out a big piece of gear, people around you notice. And when they notice a camera, it changes people's behavior. And you're not always getting that spontaneous moment that you're trying to get, because as soon as somebody sees that big lens come out, or even a Fujifilm X100 for that matter, they notice it. The GR series, on the other hand, if you pull that out and hold it up in a crowded location, very few people are going to differentiate it from cell phone unless they're looking right at it. And it opens up opportunities for things like candid street photography that are really difficult to do with some larger cameras.
Mitchell, let's talk a little bit about some of the improvements. You talked about how they were mostly iterative, evolutionary over revolutionary. Lens, battery, ergonomics, where do you want to start?
Yeah, so both the sensor and the lens are new, which is not actually usually a given when it comes to these sort of smaller updates. But the sensor, goes from a 24 megapixel one with the 3 to a 26 megapixel with the 4. You're not going to see a huge improvement there, if any. But it is just a more modern sensor that I assume is probably easier to get. It's the same one it's likely the same one from the Sony A6700 or the Pentax K3 Mark III. You might hear me refer to Pentax. It is because they are a sister brand of Ricoh. They're the same company. So yeah, it's got sort of a newer sensor, which is nice. You might see some improvement in terms of image quality, but not a ton. And then the lens has been redesigned. They say it'll be sharper around the edges. You'll get more detail, but really what they focused on were two things. One, making it faster to deploy. So when you turn the camera on, it sort of is ready to shoot faster. The order that they are talking about is, I believe they say the 3 starts in 0.8 seconds and the 4 starts in 0.6 seconds. So it is a 0.2 second difference.
Did you test that? Did you measure that?
I have not, because I am not capable of starting and stopping a stopwatch with that level of precision. However, I will say that it feels different. It does, you can feel it even if it would be very difficult to measure. And then another thing that they said they focused on with the lens is making it so that it will sort of take in less dust when it's retracting and extending. And that was actually something that a lot of GR3 owners complained about, is because, like Dale said, you put this in your pocket, dust will get around it. When you turn on the lens, it may suck it into the camera and wind up on the sensor. With normal cameras, we've got a guide on DP, or with interchangeable lens cameras, we've got a guide on DPReview on how to clean those off. But with the camera like this, where it's all one piece, unless you're willing to completely disassemble it, you can't get that dust off the sensor. And so now they say, well, the new lens design is much less likely to suck in dust. And if it does, well, we put an anti-static coating on the sensor now, so that when it does its little shake on startup, it has a better chance of knocking it off. So that's one of those things that's like, doesn't really show up on a spec sheet, but it very much could improve the real world experience of carrying this camera around every day and using it.
What about the focal length?
The focal length is the same. Currently, when the one that's launching this week is the 28 mil Equiv one, they haven't said whether they are planning that X variant, which would have a closer to 40 mil Equiv. So currently, it's all 28 Equiv, which is different than sort of the closest competitor, which would be the Fujifilm X100 series, which has historically had a 35 mil Equiv. And those numbers don't sound all that different, but in terms of the actual perspective that you're getting, the 28 is noticeably wider. You do have to shoot it differently than you would a 35 millimeter lens.
Dale, I'd love to go back to your prior shooting experience with the 3 and the 3X. That focal length, that sweet spot of 35. Did you prefer one over the other? Was it really variable depending on what you were shooting?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because I tend to be a 35 millimeter guy. In fact, my everyday camera personally is a Fujifilm X100 series that I could just grab and go. And that's 35 millimeter, and I've really learned to shoot that well. And so when you give me a choice of 28 millimeter, which is wider, and 40 millimeter, which is a little tighter, I've got this conundrum of which direction I want to go. And I do love 28 millimeter. You can grab a little bit more of the scene, but I also like the intimacy of the 40 millimeter. And so I think I'm the kind of person that's in this trap where I kind of want both. But you know, in terms of the one that's coming out first, the 28 millimeter, excuse me, is absolutely fantastic focal length. It's a classic focal length, and for certain types of street photography or candid photography, social photography, particularly indoors where this larger sensor might add some value, it's a fantastic focal length. You just have to learn to shoot that focal length like any other focal length.
Going back to the lens, Mitchell, I know you said the deployment speed is faster. It feels faster in the field. Does that have anything to do with the construction improvements around the elements and the groupings?
Believe they said that it was because they could make the lens barrel thinner. I think the only change in terms of groups and elements is that they've added one more spherical element, and it may be arranged a bit differently. I don't believe it will be hugely different. We'll have to obviously wait until we can get it into our test scene and shoot it to sort of compare and contrast the two models, but I would expect similar performance, a bit better, but mostly it's going to be faster to deploy. The autofocus is much improved in terms of the algorithms that they're using, and potentially the speed at which they can drive it. There's a different battery in this camera, and we saw with the Sony RX100R3, which just launched, that also included a different battery but it used the same lens, but managed to drive it way faster just because of how lenses and electricity work, or at least this particular type of autofocus motor. So it is possible that that is playing a role here as well, which even if it's not, the autofocus algorithms and the new processor, they say are improved to handle low light situations with tricky lighting, better than the 3. And I've in the times that I've used the 3, I've found that it can hunt a lot, even in situations where I think, I feel like you should be able to figure out what's going on here. And Ricoh says that the 4 should be better at that. Again, something we'll have to test a bit more when we've got more time with it.
I do love that you just referred to it as you. You should be able to figure this out.
I like to personify my cameras. Speaking of the battery, though, I think any benefits that it may or may not have for the autofocus are sort of by the by. The bigger news is that it is, in fact, bigger. It's got a 40% higher capacity, which is really nice because, Meekum, I'm sure as a GR3 user that you'll be familiar with the fact that the battery life is not that great.
I can attest to that. Dale, you as well in your shooting experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't quite in the category previously as the older RX1R2 from Sony, where we always used to joke it was kind of like shooting a film camera because you got to change your battery every 36 shots. But when you're out and about and talking about a camera that fits in your pocket, one of the most annoying things is to have to stuff a bunch of extra batteries in your pocket while you're walking around. So I think this is a really good development, even if the trade-off is it went from maybe a standard SD card to a micro SD card in the process.
It did. Yes. The GR3 uses, just a regular old SD card that I'm sure we all have a million of, whereas the GR4 uses a micro SD card. Maybe a bit more obscure. You may have to go out and buy one if you don't already have one, or you might not, because the GR3 had 2 gigabytes of internal memory, and they have substantially increased that to 53 gigabytes of internal memory with the 4. With 26 megapixel files, you can get quite a few shots on 53 gigabytes of memory, so you may not even need to bring a card. And I will tell you, as someone who reviews a lot of cameras and has gone out into the field many times and been like, oh no, I left my SD card at home, having that built-in memory is really, really nice. Just not having to ever think about it until you fill it up. It's a really good experience. And now you've got sort of a more usable, more generous amount of that.
Mitchell, I'm going to jump in on that and agree with you strongly and just editorialize and say, I would like to see more camera manufacturers adopt this approach. I mean, I think we do need the ability in a good camera to put our own memory card in it, particularly if we need a particular speed or capacity or something like that. But I've really come to appreciate the built-in memory on some of the cameras I've used. And some of them, like I think it was the Sigma BF and one of the Hasselblads maybe, actually have built-in SSDs, which are quite fast. And does it change the day-to-day experience of using it? No, but it can be a huge convenience. And like you said, I don't think there's any photographer out there who's never been in the situation you just described, where you pull out the camera, press the button, and get a little warning that says no memory card inserted. And this really does get around that.
Yeah,
micro SDs are much more common in things like action cameras, but this sort of internal storage movement is becoming more popular. To your point, Dale, do you, Mitchell, think that has anything to do with this push towards app ecosystems and the sort of seamlessness between uploading your shots to the cloud and sharing them, or what's been your experience the last several months?
It definitely could. Although, funnily enough, Dale pointed out the Sigma BF earlier, which does have internal storage. I think it's like 128 gigs. It's pretty generous. That camera does not have an app at all. In fact, it can't even connect to one. But Ricoh is, in fact, with the GR4 and a little bit with the GR3 as well, pushing the app experience pretty hard, where they've got this custom app that's just for GR cameras. It's not lumped in with the Pentax DSLRs. It's just Ricoh, or it's just the GR series. And I could see how having internal memory could help make that experience even better. It's like, this is all you need. You don't need a card reader for this. You don't need even a USB-C to USB-C cable to connect it to your phone. You just take the picture and you go, and you never think about storage ever again. Speaking of the app, there are some, essentially, if you're a GR3 user, it'll work exactly the same way. Though they have hinted that they are trying to improve it in the future, maybe make it a bit easier to share color profiles. And that is one new thing on this camera. The GR4 comes with 2 new color profiles. They're supposed to be sort of cinematic. I haven't gotten to play around with them that much, though. They're like the rest of their sort of built-in color profiles. You can tweak them to match your aesthetic and other preferences for whatever you're shooting.
And Mitchell, I understand it. This camera even allows you to create film recipes similar to some of the other cameras we've seen recently. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different parameters that you can tweak. Like most cameras, it comes with sort of the default set of color modes. But they give you a lot of control over how those are recorded and sort of the tone response curves and saturation. Some of them you can even add grain to, though not all of them. Mostly it's the black and white ones, and then the cinema ones that we mentioned. So yeah, you can sort of take the standard profiles and build off of those and get sort of a look that's quite different from where you started out on. And like with Fujifilm, there is a community around these where you can go and see what other people are using. They'll show the parameters that they're using, and you can copy those and sort of get the same look out of your pictures. It's a really fun way to shoot if you're into changing sort of your the out of camera JPEG look of your photos. Obviously, it's stuff that you could already do if in RAW, but it skips that step where you don't have to take it into a computer and use Lightroom to mess around with a bunch of sliders. You just have it right out of the camera.
Yeah, I'm sensing that theme in the user experience, just everything in one place, like make it as simple as possible and remove steps. I want to go back to some of the more technical specs. Can we talk a little bit about the axis improvement for IBIS?
Yes. So the GR3, funnily enough, has a 3-axis stabilization. So the sensor can move to compensate for a bit of motion, whereas the GR4 includes 5-axis stabilization. So you get 2 more axes. I believe it can sort of go like that, as well as some other directions of movement. That gives it about a 2-stop improvement. So let's say if you were able to shoot handheld with the GR3 at 1/100th of a second, maybe you can get to 1/20th of a second on the GR4. obviously that is the optimal condition, and it won't do anything if your subject is moving, but it gives you a bit more leeway in sort of shooting in darker scenarios, or if you want to make sure you're using a fast shutter speed or a low aperture setting to get really freeze motion or to get a wide depth of field.
And then what about some of these in-camera new aspect ratios?
This seems to be a big theme of photography lately. So with the GR3, you could shoot at 1:1, so square, or 3:2, which is just the full sensor. You can now do 4:3 or 16:9. So the 16:9, I feel like, works with the cinematic color profiles, just because it's like a very filmic or like movie-like aspect ratio. But yeah, it's just another way that you can tweak your JPEGs to get sort of the look that you're going for, and it gives you another parameter to play around with. Like with most of the settings on the GR, you can access those through sort of on-screen menus that you control with the dials. So it's called the adjust menu. You just press in on the rear dial, which is now a dial instead of a sort of, on this camera, it is a two-way jog lever. It just means that you can sort of keep spinning it rather than having to go. It's a different way of shooting. Some people may like it. Some people may be like, I wish I had the jog rocker back. It's totally preference. But you press in on the rear dial and you can sort of go to one of your menus and scroll down, and one of those options is the aspect ratio. Of course, you can choose color modes, you can choose your autofocus point. It's completely customizable. So you can choose up to 5 settings that you can adjust through that menu. Or, Richard Butler, he likes to have 3 because he doesn't want to have the clutter. He just wants to be able to focus on what he wants to focus on, and go from there. So if aspect ratio is something that you appreciate, you can easily set it up to make that very easy to change, without the need for a big dial on it, like say some other cameras have had, for purely dedicated to the aspect ratio.
Is there also, there's some changes to the exposure comp rocker as well? Is that different from?
It has one now.
It has one.
So yeah, the GR3, when it came out, there was a plus and minus, there was a plus and minus rocker right here on the original GR and the GR2, sort of the current lineup. There's actually been, so like Daryl talked about, there's the film lineup of GR, then there were the GR digitals, and now there's just the GR again, although those are also digital. But the GR1 and 2 had this rocker that was used for exposure compensation. GR3 took it away, and now it is back on the GR4. So that's an additional control that you get that you didn't have on the 3.
It feels like this effort is really paying close attention to the feedback of its users, which I find very refreshing. Would you agree with that? Disagree?
I do agree with that. And in fact, it's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot. There's some great examples of that. We see a lot of user feedback about dust on the sensor on this camera. I mean, it's a fantastic pocket camera, but as Mitchell pointed out, pockets have lint, pockets have dust. It is a great way to get dust on a sensor. And I think Ricoh heard that. Another great example of that is the flash. Earlier versions of this series had a built-in flash. The GR3 did not have a built-in flash, and that was very polarizing. On the one hand, it kept the camera small and slim and allowed it to fit in your pocket, while allowing some other upgrades. But for those who wanted a flash, it took away a flash. And you'll notice if you look at pictures, the camera doesn't have a flash, but Ricoh has introduced this auxiliary flash. It's a very tiny unit, fits right on top. And if you want a flash, you can have it. And I think the beauty of that approach is that you don't have to pay for it if you don't want it. One of the pieces of feedback we hear a lot from photographers is, don't make me pay for features I don't want. And I get that. We all feel that way about certain features. Well, look, if you don't want a flash, you don't have to pay for it. And if you do, you can buy it and stick it on the camera and have it, and you can have it both ways. So I think there has been a lot of attention paid to user feedback on this model. I'm sure I could cite some other examples as well, but Mitchell, I'll toss over to you because you've probably got some on top of mind. Yeah.
So like you said, they heard that, some users wanted the rocker back. Sure, we'll add it back. And a lot of people are like, oh, we wish this was weather sealed, which would solve the dust problem. Well, they didn't do that, but they did, in fact, they took some steps to solve the dust problem. So yeah, I think they are sort of looking, especially with a camera like this, where a lot of the customers are part of this devoted fan base who has had them for the past 20 years. There's definitely a big element of, well, how can we make this better for you? What do you want? And we'll look to address that in the next thing. Like Dale said, there's the auxiliary flash. It's $119, and it is truly small.
It's so cute.
They actually demonstrated quite a few times that you can put it in, some jeans have like that extra small pocket that I'm sure someone from Gear Patrol could tell me what it was originally.
Is that what that pocket is for? Is for a flash?
It fits in there. There are third-party options that you can get from like Godox that are cheaper. But
what is the price point, Mitchell?
It's $119. Yeah. So you could get one from Godox that's going to be $30-$40, but it won't be as small. It won't aesthetically fit with the camera, and it won't have a lot of the auto features that this flash has. So it's not a TTL metering flash, but it knows your camera's exposure settings and the distance from the subject, so it can sort of tune the amount of light that it's putting out. It can also be used in manual mode. In fact, it can be used with the GR3 in manual mode, though it doesn't have the auto. And then when you turn the camera off, the flash turns off because it has a separate battery, which is nice because, while the GR4's battery is improved, it is still a small battery. And so you can use the flash without draining any battery from the camera. It charges via USB-C, and when you turn the camera off, the flash turns off. It doesn't turn on when you turn the camera on because, that's how you get accidental, oops, I didn't mean to shoot with a flash on, which would be terrible for, discrete street photography. It's just not going to work. But yeah, it's a nice little accessory. Like Dale said, you can buy it if you want the flash. It does suck that you do have to buy it if you want the flash, but, the fact that you have the option now is nice.
I can't believe this, but we haven't talked about price. That's usually the first thing we lead with in these chats.
This is going to be a hot topic, Kim.
I'm glad that we saved it for last. So if you made it this far, now you can join in the heated discussion about price. Mitchell, what can you tell us?
So when the GR3 launched, I believe it was $899. So, this was back in 2019, I want to say, or 2018, a couple years ago now. So it was $899, and as time has gone on, tariffs have come in, inflation has come in, it has crept up. Nowadays, if you can find one in stock, they're usually selling for around $1,100, or some of them are selling for even more, like $1,200. The GR4 is $1,499, which is quite a jump up, especially if you're comparing it to that $899 number or the $799 that the GR2 was selling for right afterwards. So it is expensive. It is cheaper than sort of the Fujifilm X100 series still, although there's a lot of things that you get for your money when you go to that series. Like that has a built-in flash, and it has a viewfinder, and it has a faster lens, but at the cost of not being as pocketable. So yeah, it is much more of an investment now. Once you push past that $1,000 point, you have to think about it differently, and especially this camera is well past that $1,000 point. It is what it is, I guess. I don't know what else to say other than that. What hasn't gotten more expensive, and it is a product not made in the US. So for US buyers, you are going to have to almost certainly contend with tariffs.
I do think this is going to be sticker shock for a lot of people just because it's such a dramatic jump. But as you pointed out, Mitchell, I mean, if I were Ricoh, I would probably do the same thing. I'm looking around and I'm seeing GR3s selling used for hundreds of dollars more than people paid for them new, up to $1,200 in some cases. And when you throw in, a few costs of development, and hey, you can't even buy this thing. The GR is one of those cameras that very often you're on a wait list to get. And if you've got a product where people are on a wait list to buy it, and the previous model is selling for hundreds of dollars more than you retailed it for, I'd probably do the same thing. But yeah, it's going to be sticker shock to people who are used to the previous price point.
Especially because this is sort of the platonic ideal of a second camera. You have your main camera that you do your work with, and you go off and shoot. And for some people, this will be that. But for a lot of people, this is going to be the camera that they buy for every day, and they've got their other camera. Well, that other camera has probably gotten more expensive. Certainly the lenses for it have. And this now has gotten more expensive too. So it is price of the hobby is going up. I will say, with the RX 103 from Sony that we saw earlier this year, that price was astronomical. It's like $5,100 in the US. This is still priced within the realm of mortals. I think when we were talking about the RX 103, we all said, no.
The realm of mortals.
Yeah, there's like no way we would ever buy that. Whereas this, certainly I would have to consider it more, but I could afford $1,500. I could, if I was saving up for it, I could be like, yeah, I really want that, and I'll buy one for myself, and not feel like I have to treat it like a crown jewel. It doesn't have to be placed under a box every morning with heat and pressure sensitive sensors to make sure no one heists it.
That said, this is the type of camera that I think you could use for a long time. I don't see this as a camera that you turn over every couple of years. I've definitely run into people that have older GR models, GR1s, GR2s that they're still using and feel no need to upgrade because they really serve the need they bought it for. So, if you're thinking about it as a long-term, I'm not going to use the word investment, though you almost could with the GR3, given the inflation on the used market. It certainly probably justifies the price if it's something you're going to use over a decade-long window.
It's also sort of going back to the focal length discussion. At under $1,000, if you're a 35 millimeter shooter or some other focal length that you prefer, and you look at a 28 millimeter camera, you might be, it's $900. I'll give it a shot. If it doesn't work out, I'll flip it and whatever. It is a bigger commitment, and especially if you're one of the people who prefers the X model, well, you're probably not going to want to buy this one until that X model comes out, because it is much more money to spend now. You do have to think more about laying out that amount of cash on something that may not be your absolute most preferred focal length. So it is something to think about.
Given the price increase, I think the big question, and Mitchell, you're the only one on the call who's actually held one in your hands, and I'm not saying that this necessarily gives you a lot more insight on the question I'm about to ask, but if you're a GR3 owner and you're really excited about the GR4, is this a camera worth the upgrade?
That's definitely something that I would feel more confident in answering once I see really how big those updates to the autofocus are and to the battery, because it's only rated for 50 shots more in terms of battery life. So the GR3 is 200, this one's 250, which is only a 25% increase versus the 40% increase in capacity. So that's interesting. But with the GR3, you often did not actually get 200 shots. So if it can get anywhere close to the rating, then it'll be in a better position. I think if you're looking at the spec sheet and you think they haven't changed a lot, that doesn't tell the whole story. There is a lot more to the experience of this camera that is, I think, substantially different from the GR3. So I would say if you there's some cameras where it comes out where it's like, oh no, if you have the previous one, there's actually no point to buying this one. But this one, I would say, if you are a GR3 owner looking at it, I totally understand. And if I had the GR3, from what I've used of it, I would probably be looking at upgrading, especially sort of if you can sell it for as much as you bought it for now before the price crashes. If you can get the most out of it, it might help make that higher price go down a bit easier.
It holds its value, apparently, right? The older models have continued.
Who knows?
To be scarce and increase.
I'm not sure the introduction of the new model is going to impact the price of used ones at all. I mean, you're still saving money by buying a used one, even paying hundreds of dollars more than it sold for new.
Well, and the 3 currently, the X is still on sale on B&H and Adorama here, at least in the US, but the 3 you can't get anymore. They've stopped selling it.
You can't even find it.
Yeah. So that is, and now it's marked as discontinued on B&H's website. Before it was just listed as out of stock. So as for whether there's really been a change in sort of the outcome of the thing, where you still can't buy one. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a market still for the 3. But I would also say that there's definitely reasons to go with the 4.